Thank you. And if you were looking for a public intellectual, I think you've invited the wrong guy. But I want to also acknowledge the First Nations elders of the land on which we meet, and not only pay my respects to them, but also express my impatience for a treaty or treaties, which are long overdue and may go some small way to redressing some of the wrongs of our past, and we can't move forward, in my view, until we do that. I used to think that the traditional owners of the land on which we met were the Baileys, but now I know it's the Murray Smiths as well. And I'd like to thank them for the invitation, and I hope I don't disappoint. Your standards are ridiculously high. But as a public provocateur, I think I should start by registering my complaint, because clearly the committee for the Stephen Murray Smith Memorial Lecture couldn't find a single cisgendered, non-neurotypical woke extinction rebel whose messages these days are undoubtedly more compelling than the ramblings of a failed shock jock. Talkback being what it is, like a national complaints hotline, 1300 222 774. It's also the ideal refuge for unattractive, self-important narcissists with clear proof of their superpowers, their superiority, and with zero capacity for self-doubt, and also boasting short attention spans. And speaking of Alan Jones, there's a often told story around red wine speckled lunch tables in the media about an incident early in the Parrots. Did you know that's his nickname, the Parrot? And there's a story there, but it's not suitable for public discussion. The Parrot's early broadcasting career, where, like most desperate, needy shock jocks, he was desperately trying to attract an audience, so they used to run a competition. Compared to himself, of course, he knows that the audience are absolute dills, so he runs a competition where he invites the audience to ring up. They can mention a word. He'll tell them whether or not it's a real word that's in the Oxford Dictionary. But if you can catch him out, you win a trip to Bali. Caller. G'day, Alan. Got a word for you. Ah, good, says the Parrot. Who's calling? Rick here. G'day, Rick. Good to hear from you. Go on, try me. I'll tell you whether or not your word is in the dictionary. My word is goen. G-O-E-N. Oh, how do you spell that, Rick? G-O-E-N. You know, just like I said it. No, that's not a real word, Rick. You've made that up. It's not in the dictionary. But now, for a trip to Bali, put it into context and explain to me if I'm wrong. Sure. Alan, you're a fucking drongo. Go and fuck yourself. Well, the Parrot's flustered. He reaches for the dump button. Doesn't get there in time. Couple of calls go through. Half an hour later, half an hour of redneck yobbo drivel. A man rings in who's an altogether different kettle of fish. Good morning, Mr. Jones. I think I have a word that may challenge you. Ah, says the Parrot. You sound like someone who's got a bit of class and knows how to use the language well. Who am I speaking with? Oh, it's Jeremy here, Alan. Well, good morning to you, Jeremy. Now, what's your word? Ah, the word, Alan, it's smee. S-M-E-E. No, that's not in the Oxford Dictionary. Never heard of it. Can't be a real word, but for a trip to Bali. Tell me I'm wrong. Put it into context. Of course. It's me again, you fucking drongo, and you can still go and fuck yourself. Did I mention Alan Jones as corrupt and unethical? It's true, apart from being rude, misogynistic and arrogant, he's also found by a properly convened tribunal after a lengthy investigation and a hearing to be corrupt and unethical. I refer, for any of you who may have even forgotten or never knew, I refer to the findings of the Australian Broadcasting Tribunal at the time of the Cash for Comment scandals in 1999 and 2000, when our dear friends at Media Watch, then in the hands of the excellent Richard Ackland, uncovered that John Laws, Alan Jones and some others were found to have been doing secret deals under the table to accept cash to provide favourable treatment for banks, Qantas, Foxtel and the Sydney Casino. The full amounts were thought to total as much as $18 million. Now, this led to me learning one of the great lessons of my broadcasting life, and a lesson about my own craft, courtesy of none other than John Howard. Shortly after the Broadcasting Tribunal's findings were made public, John Howard, who was a consistent user of talkback, who maintained a perpetual conversation with the Australian voters through using talk radio, wherever he went around the country, every week he would pop up somewhere in a radio studio and used it to stay in touch. And just the day after the Broadcasting Tribunal, when Jones, Laws and the others were on the front page, John Howard was coming in for one of his quite regular chats with me at the ABC. John Howard came into the studio, as he did each time, with not a single piece of paper in front of him, no briefing notes. He didn't have, like most political leaders, he didn't have a folder that had lots of post-it notes and yellow stickers, and if you said, now about the freeway, he'd go flick, 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 flick through. All the premiers and prime ministers pretty much have done that, but no. John Howard had an encyclopedic knowledge of what he was doing. He had a brilliant memory and never was lost for a detail. If you wanted to ask him about vertical fiscal imbalance and the 1997 budget, he could match you blow for blow, even though you'd researched it meticulously to prepare and he hadn't. But on this day, he's coming into my studio, me being a bit of a smart-ass and a professional provocateur. I thought, along with questions about why we're going to war in Iraq and all those other things, I think I might just ask him what I thought was a perler of a question. Prime Minister, given the findings of the Broadcasting Tribunal about Mr Jones, Mr Laws and others, and given that you're a regular person appearing on their programs in the studio, given that they've been found to be corrupt and unethical, did I mention that already? I might not have, but I just thought I'd say it. Given that they've been found to have breached broadcasting standards, will you continue to appear on their programs? Fair question? Good question. Very proud of myself, I was. And John Howard looked at me and he squinted a little bit, smiled, which was not common, and then said, you know, John, when I come in here to talk to you, I'm not really coming in to talk to you. I'm coming in to talk to your audience. And as long as those men have an audience, I'll go on and talk to them too. Game, set, match, John Howard. He knew more about what I was doing than I did. He understood it better than a career broadcaster. Sadly, Mr Jones continues to use his powers for evil rather than good. The latest review, in inverted commas, that's been conducted would be about the 843rd. It's a bit like Toby Green in the Tribunal, really, isn't it? Collingwood, I mean, really, John, but still. It is Melbourne and it is September, so there you go, it had to happen. My primary concern, though, is, and there's an illustration of why, my primary concern is that this thing we call democracy that we treasure is fragile, and we somewhat take it for granted. Populists, liars, racists and fanatics are putting democracy through an unprecedented stress test. And it's not standing up very well. It's creaking, it's groaning, it's threatening to burst a valve. And like any piece of machinery, if you don't do the maintenance, democracy can break. We've neglected the basic repairs. The bearings need some grease and the motor needs fresh oil. The fundamentals to me are publicly accountable politicians, elections that are beyond question, an anti-corruption watchdog with real bite, regulators who reject cosy deals with those they're supposed to be regulating, and a truly independent media that holds power to account. And if we don't nurture those features, then we slip and slide down the same perilous paths that some other democracies seem to be going down. Now, take this analogy from a petrol head, who's also a political tragic. Daimler and Benz applied the internal combustion engine to the horseless carriage in 1895 and named their first car after Daimler's daughter, Mercedes. It was the first time there was a viable car, as we would call it now. It took at least another 10 years, though, before a system of rules were created in the different countries where cars instantly became popular. It took at least another decade before there were rules about who could drive them, how you drove them, how fast you could go, whether you needed someone with a flag walking in front of you. What happened when two of these horseless carriages came into contact with each other, to say nothing of drink-drive laws or insurance that took many more years to evolve. We are at exactly the same point with another set of society-changing inventions and technologies as they were then. We have new technology, the digital revolution, this fabulous gadget, and we haven't got the rules to go with it. And exactly in the same way as the entrepreneurs behind automobiles lobbied ferociously for there to be no rules, for the people who owned the cars to be the ones who are responsible, for governments to get out of the way and allow them to unroll this fabulous new society-changing technology without limits and restrictions, in exactly the same self-interested but ridiculous way, the digital billionaires, who are sounding more and more like pirates, the digital billionaires are arguing that there should be no regulation of their almost overnight fortunes and the businesses that have generated them. It is absurd, and I'll get into some detail in a moment. Some paradoxes. We're supposedly, through this technology, more connected than ever, but we have unprecedented levels of loneliness. We understand more about what makes us healthy and happy, but we have epidemics of disease, obesity, anxiety, and depression. We have access to all the libraries in the world, including some that have more visitors than this one, all the universities in the world, through the gadgets in our pocket, but we trust knowledge less than ever. And indeed, science is under question. Science. Science isn't opinion. Science is science. Science is fact. One of my favourite paradoxes, the very people who say we must trust the science on global warming argue vociferously that we can't trust the science on genetically modified crops. And the people who argue we must trust the science on genetically modified crops say that, many of them, that global warming and climate change is bunkum. You can't cherry pick science. It's value neutral. It is evidence-based. And the fact that people are holding it in lower regard at any time since before the Enlightenment is little short of ridiculous. Technology can be a force for democracy and equality, but the people who control it are behaving like totalitarians. They argue vigorously and lobby against any harnessing of their power or their wealth. They don't want to pay taxes. They don't want to be subjected to regulation. They want to argue that they're not publishers. They're not responsible for what they put online. You're the publisher. They're just providing the pipe. This is patently bullshit, but they're trying to get away with it. And who can blame them? After all, it can be extremely inconvenient and sometimes expensive to have to be responsible for what's published in your name. I'm always reminded, and I'm fond of quoting, the English scurrilous rag Private Eye, which thanks to some very deep-pocketed individuals, was able to scandalise, and still does scandalise, what's left of the United Kingdom for generations, well, decades anyway. My favourite Private Eye extract came when they ran a story about a TV rental company that was ripping people off with, guess what? Time payment plans, nothing's changed, there's nothing new under the sun. The manager of TV Rentals Limited, Mr. Arkell, was pretty pissed off with Private Eye and consulted his lawyers, who wrote a letter to Private Eye in the following terms. So we act for Mr. Arkell, who is the Managing Director of TV Rentals Limited. His attention is drawn to the article published on page 9 on your 19th of April edition. The claims made and the comments published about Mr. Arkell are untrue and clearly highly defamatory of our client. We're instructed to request your advice on your proposal for dealing with these matters. Mr. Arkell's first concern is that an apology be published at the earliest possible date in Private Eye, and he will require damages. Indeed, his attitude to damages will be governed by the nature of your reply. Yours sincerely. The reply from Private Eye was priceless. Dear sirs, we acknowledge your letter and note that you act for Mr. Arkell. We also note that Mr. Arkell's attitude to damages will be governed by the nature of our reply, and therefore we would be grateful if you could advise us as to what his attitude to damages would be were he to learn that the nature of our reply is fuck off. Nothing more was heard from them. Private Eye continues to thrive, and that correspondence was 30 years ago. So we have innovation, but we have little progress. People are travelling more than at any time in the history of the human race, but we're more suspicious of strangers than we have ever been. There are more stateless people and more humanity swirling homeless and lost around the globe at any time since the end of hostilities in World War II. And the backlash against migrants and people claiming refugee status all over the world is extraordinary. Indeed, it's becoming increasingly clear, I would have thought, if not unarguable, that the populism we're seeing that's driving things in the US, that's driven Brexit, Turkey, Hungary, Italy, pretty much wherever you look at the moment, a lot of it, at its core, when it's distilled down, is driven by a strict reaction, a clear reaction against migration. The more you talk to people about Brexit, the more you try and clarify what they're worried about, more and more it's about migration. So this epidemic of distrust, disillusion and division flows, I suspect, from an unprecedented concentration of power and wealth. Many people, ordinary people, people who work hard and want nothing particularly fancy in their lives, but get up in the morning, go to work, want their kids to go to school and get a job and have progress. They're working harder than ever, but they feel they're never going to get ahead. They feel that their share of the prosperity they see around them is beyond their grasp. It's therefore not surprising they look for someone to blame. Their view is that the elites have been grasping, greedy, and patronise them. We may be breaking sales records for Ferraris, but we can't afford an increase to Newstart. How can that be? The Monday after this year's federal election, in May, on May the 18th, I opened up the talkback lines and asked if there was anyone listening who could explain Queensland to me. Along with the other callers, I think the third caller was David, who called from Kingaroy. He said, "I'll explain Queensland for you, John. We're conservative, parochial, church-going, we don't like outsiders, and we don't like your LGBTI stuff from down south. That's not our way." So I asked him a few searching questions, not too rough. Said, "Fascinated. Thank you. Appreciate your call." Within minutes, I got a call from Sue from Coburg. She was livid. I can't believe that man from Queensland. I said, oh, you mean David from Kingaroy? I mean, what is going on there? Why did you let him say that? I can't believe you allowed his homophobic rant on the ABC. You, shades of Kingaroy coming through there. She said, you treated him with respect. You treated him with respect. For Sue from Coburg, I was the problem because I treated a man with respect who she disagreed with. I think Sue from Coburg's the problem because no matter what somebody thinks, no matter how strongly you disagree, no matter how fundamentally there's a clash of values, they're still entitled to respect. He wasn't saying something outrageous. He was expressing his personal view. And he was also generously, I thought, offering to give us here in Melbourne an insight into a community that many of us were struggling to understand. So I actually thought Sue from Coburg ended up being the problem. But there's another level at which things are inexplicable. I mentioned before that I'm worried about the online obsessions that people are having. I've just come in on the train this evening. I think I was the only person in a crowded train carriage that didn't have my nose buried in a phone. And I had a look around to see what people were doing. There were some people playing games and there were some people who were reading books or magazines. Most people, though, were on their social media. And the biggest problem with social media, whether Sue from Coburg was really Sue and whether she was from Coburg, I don't know, but anonymity online is an even bigger problem. Anyone can say anything they like about anybody else online and not be held to account. Now, the people who run the Fang companies, that's Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix and Google, the pirates who are controlling so much of commerce and so much of our public intercourse these days, the Fang Pirates, as I want to call them, they defend online anonymity all the way through. They argue that it's a point of principle, it's a matter of freedom, it's a matter of their constitutional or commercial right, that they're providing us with a service, all of which is self-serving drivel designed to simply defend their extraordinary profits. Online anonymity is toxic and is undoing our civil society. How can it be, and how can it be defended, that anyone can say anything and never be held to account for it? And how can a publisher, and they are publishers, they just are, how can they possibly claim not to be in any way responsible or accountable? I'm fond of retelling the story about Rupert Murdoch, when as a young newspaper proprietor, given only a small fortune in one newspaper by his father in Adelaide, was starting to venture into the tabloid trash for which he's now renowned and which we're also grateful for. And standing beside the presses as the papers rolled off with some front page scandal, Rupert's lawyers stood there and said, but Rupert, you can't print that. And he turned on them famously and said, it's not your job to tell me what I can or can't print. It's your job to tell me how much it will cost me if I choose to print it. But at least he's prepared to be accountable. The pirates in the Fang companies, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, they're not prepared to be accountable. They want to make the profits without picking up the price. I don't understand how they've got away with it. Is it because it's fashionable? Is it because it's thought to be exciting? Are they entrepreneurs? No, they're just old-fashioned pirates. It has to stop. It has to stop soon, and I'm delighted to see that gradually now around the world, both in Europe, President Macron recently has said we're not putting up with this anymore. The UK, well, they haven't got time to do anything at the moment, so there's no point expecting anything to happen there. And President Trump, well, hey, we're not going to expect President Trump to rein in the excesses of Twitter. Don't hold your breath waiting for that, which is a bit like in Azerbaijan, the Electoral Commission, where they published the results of the election the day before the poll. I'm told Peter Dutton's heading off to Azerbaijan for a study tour. But too much change too quickly, it's spooked our society. And those who feel they're not getting to share in the spoils, at some point, will say, well, we're not putting up with this anymore. I think our social licence is under threat. There are other concerns I have: the gap between country and city, the gap between the tech savvy and the digitally deprived, the globally comfortable, those who see the world as their backyard, and those who are stuck locally and don't get to go anywhere and don't understand what a different society might be like. Those gaps are getting bigger and more dangerous. Jan and I recently went on a considerable road trip. We went to visit our elder son who lives in Arnhem Land in a town called Ramingining. And to get there, we drove basically in a straight line through New South Wales and into Queensland. We went through from St George to Charleville to Barcaldine, Winton, Mount Isa, and across to Mataranka and through up into Arnhem Land that way. The gap between city and country's never been greater. And it's a gap that gets wider at our peril. They don't understand us here in inner city Melbourne, and increasingly I suspect we don't understand them. It's not good. But with Talkback, everyone gets their chance. They air their outrage, their grievances. Everyone's equal, whether they're a Nobel Prize winner or the village idiot. It's incredibly democratic. We all get to vote. Each vote is equal. But what do we do about this? We're told that society has capacity constraints. This is usually used in the terms of engineering. We're building tunnels and freeways and roads and level crossings we're abolishing level crossings and so on at a frantic pace, in particular in this community at the moment. We're told there are capacity constraints. The mining industry says, well, you've bled us drive engineers, we're going to have to import them all. Everyone's competing for concrete and gravel and cement mixers and graders and tractors and people who know how to use them. And I agree, that's a real issue as we try and catch up on the infrastructure lag of decades and decades. But there's another capacity constraint that no one talks about. The capacity to be ethical, the capacity to be less selfish. Put simply, the capacity to do the right thing. I think we need to reassert civic and collective goals. We need to be more active in maintaining this democratic machine, instead of just leaving it to those decreasing numbers of people who are mechanically savvy. You can't outsource being a citizen, just like you can't outsource empathy to the gig economy. Yes, you can find someone to wipe bottoms in nursing homes, but that's not the same as caring about the people whose bottoms are being wiped. So we need to rediscover our inner activist. I told you I was a provocateur, but I don't care what the cause is. Well, there are limits. But whatever it is that gets your pulse racing, whatever the idea, whatever the cause, we need to re-establish our contribution to it. When we had the centenary of Federation, there was some research done about what makes for a strong community and what makes for an active democracy. And it was discovered that there is a direct correlation between a strong democracy and choirs. The more people sing together in a society, the more democratic that society will be. Now, we can over-intellectualise this, and if I was a public intellectual, I'd cite 14 PhD theses about it, but in fact it's really straightforward. For a choir to work, people have to work together. They have to accept a common goal and direction by someone whose authority they accept. We're losing it. We need to sing more. So we need to stop being afraid of ideas. We need to stop being afraid of common endeavour. We have to stop saying, you can't say that, like Sue from Coburg. And instead, we have to engage in the contest of ideas. Sometimes it means rolling up your sleeves and getting your fingers dirty. And you have to do it in a way that is respectful. We need to call out self-interest whenever we see it, describe it as it is, and we have to reassure everyone that they are equal before the law. And that's in practice, not just in theory. The size of your defence fund should never affect the outcome of your trial. Yes, you can appeal to the High Court. Whether it's a lost cause or not, we'll find out. But it's astonishing with George Pell, let's not pretend I'm not talking about it. It's astonishing that you can basically have the most lavish, extensive and expensive defence in Australian court and criminal justice history and still say you didn't get a fair trial. We need to, in simple terms, we need to tell our community's stories better. And if you reduce what I do to its simplest, I'm a storyteller and I help other people tell their stories. We have to explain complexity instead of shrugging our shoulders and saying, oh, I don't know what that is and I'm not even sure it matters. Whether you're a brain surgeon or a merchant banker or a librarian or a panel beater, whether you're a butcher or a gardener, if you can't explain what you do, why you do it the way you do it, how much it'll cost, and when it'll be done by, well, you shouldn't be doing brain surgery, merchant banking, or butchering. You have to be able to tell your story. And it's not that hard. We need to remind those who volunteer to represent us, and they are volunteers, that it's us they're there for, not the lobbyists and not the political donors, especially when they claim they don't even know who those political donors are. And as I'm fond of saying, I love quoting myself after all. No one else quotes me. Progress is neither inevitable nor linear. It's neither inevitable nor linear. We get progress because we make it happen. Don't take it for granted. Don't take it for granted at all. A word or three, if I may, about some things that matter to me. I'm always astonished. I get a microphone for 3.5 hours a day and then I'm in front of another one for even longer. And I can't believe it. No one's walked out. Well, only this woman over here's fallen asleep. No one else has. And I'm grateful for that. But when I get the chance in front of hundreds of you, I want to acknowledge that the very kind words, John, that you said about me are very difficult for me to hear because I totally disavow the notion of the great broadcaster. It's a slippery slope. If you believe your own bullshit, you end up like Alan Jones. I'm kept, and have for my 30 years at the ABC, been kept on a very even keel by the magnificent Jan, who's unwell and unable to be with us here tonight. She sends her apology. But I'll come home and I'll say, oh my God, you should have heard I had so-and-so stuck for words, this minister, the Prime Minister, the Premier, captains of industry, absolutely on toast. And she'll go, I don't give a shit, pick up the dog poo from the backyard, please. You were supposed to do it last weekend. Without that, I honestly can say there is no way I would have been able to stay on air for the period of time that I have. I can't thank her enough. The ABC is an extraordinary institution, and as a tiny little link in a long and honourable chain, it's been an absolute blast and a privilege to have been able to get a little bit of leverage off that Lissajou, as the symbol is called. It's the most powerful brand in the country. When the Howard government was elected in what was it, 95, 6? Thank you, Barry Jones. Bing. When they were elected, one of the first things John Howard did was he told his Minister for Communications, Richard Alston, to order a review of the ABC. Richard Alston retained a leading businessman in order to do it. He found the man who had been in charge of McDonald's and Optus and commissioned him to do a review. The Mansfield review into the ABC took months of consultation, and he went around the country speaking to people about an institution that the Liberal Party were determined, I think I can say this, they were determined to nobble. When he finished his review, he went and saw the minister, and I've had this anecdote given to me by none other than the minister, Richard Alston himself. He came in, he slammed down the document on the minister's desk and said, "There you are, there's my review. You tamper with this at your peril. And you don't do it in my name. You tamper with this, the ABC, at your peril and not in my name. I have never seen McDonald's, Optus, I've never seen brand loyalty within cooey of the loyalty and the love and the affection that people have for the ABC. It's an extraordinary institution, and working there sometimes feels like you're in an institution, but that's because it's a bureaucracy, and all bureaucracies have their flaws. But it's been an extraordinary privilege and an absolute blast. I guess we engage, like this library, in the contest of ideas. And may it long continue. It's a giant forum, whether it's within a building or whether it's on the airwaves. It's an extraordinary thing, and it will continue, it will endure, long after people say, who was John Fane? And what did he do? And I'm quite looking forward to retreating away from the limelight, away from the spotlight, and being a human being again instead of a broadcaster. Thank you very much for your indulgence. I hope you've got some value from my words tonight, and I'm happy to answer some questions. Thank you.